Welcome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, whether you're a Peninsula Streams and Sea Change Pacific Salmon Foundation longtime follower, or you received a pamphlet in your door and you're curious about what this is all about. We really appreciate you tuning in tonight. My name is Kyle Armstrong. I'm the restoration coordinator for Peninsula Streams and Shorelines. Tonight I'm joined by Kyla Sheehan, who's the project coordinator, the project manager for the Resilient Coast for Salmon program, Pacific Salmon Foundation initiative. And she's joined by Maria Canzero, who's the project coordinator for that program. We also have Nikki Wright, who is the director of the Sea Change Conservation Foundation, as well as her partner in crime, Sarah Cook, who's another director and sliding into that executive director role in the very near future, as well as Ian Bruce, my executive coordinator for the Peninsula Streams and Shorelines organization as well. Thank you so much for coming. I would really like to just acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Wasanich Nations, the Sinchothan speaking people, as well as, and I'm tuning in from the Lekwungen people, known today as the Songhees Nation and the Esquimalt Nation. Tonight we have a presentation looking at nature-based solutions to shoreline protection, looking at solutions that work for both people and nature. And we're on a little bit of a tight time frame tonight. The first presentation will be about 30 minutes. That will be from the Pacific Salmon Foundation, and then we'll follow that up with another 30-minute presentation on kind of Seam Harbor conservation and restoration, as well as Roberts Bay. At the very end, we'll have a time for question and answers period, but this may go over the scheduled 8 p.m. time. So hopefully you can hang in there with us as we have, hopefully an opportunity to discuss some of the questions and concerns that come out of this presentation. Without further ado, I will leave it to Kyla Sheehan. Kyla, take it away.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks for that introduction. Maria and I are presenting this evening on behalf of the Resilient Coast for Salmon project, which is a part of the Pacific Salmon Foundation. And it's a 5-year collaborative partnership that's led by the PSF with the Stewardship Center for BC, Peninsula Stream Society, World Wildlife Canada, and other partners. So I'm just going to run you through a little agenda of what we'll talk about this evening. So we'll give an overview of what Resilient Coast for Salmon is, kind of our main goals of the project, our funding and our partnerships. And then we'll jump into one of our main things that we've been working on lately, which is our educational primer. And so we'll cover what is the value of our natural shorelines and what are the impacts of coastal hard armoring and how they impact coastal processes. And then we'll give an overview of climate change impacts, including sea level rise. Then we'll take a brief look at our toolkit and then our demonstration sites on the east coast of Vancouver Island, and finish up with an overview of our shoreline mapping component of the project. So Resilient Coast for Salmon is funded through the Climate Action and Awareness Fund. This is through Environment and Climate Change Canada. And so, as I mentioned, it's a 5-year project. And throughout the 5 years, we aim to raise awareness on the impacts of climate change and the value of natural shorelines and nature-based solutions as adaptation to climate change, as well as build professional capacity around the greening of shorelines and foster stewardship on shorelines of the south and east coast of Vancouver Island. And as I mentioned, it's a really collaborative project that's led by PSF, but we have partnerships with local municipal and Indigenous governments and stewardship and conservation groups throughout the project region. And Resilient Coast is the latest project within PSF's Marine Science program. So we'll just take a look at our geographic scope. As we go through our 5 years, we're traveling up the east coast of the island. So year 1 was in that green polygon there in the Greater Victoria area. And we just got started last April. So now we're into year 2 and we're moving all the way up to Nanaimo. So that's within the yellow polygon there. And the project can be put into 4 categories or 4 components. We have raising awareness, building capacity, contributing to shoreline mapping data, and demonstrating nature-based solutions through restoration sites. So with our first component, we want to raise awareness on the impacts of climate change projections to coastal communities on the east coast of Vancouver Island, plus spread the word about the use of nature-based solutions, including the Green Shores framework, in response to those impacts. And we also want to support municipalities to make more informed planning decisions to adapt to climate change. And we also want to focus on capacity building by providing the Stewardship Center's Green Shores training and contribute to building a community of practice for shoreline professionals like coastal engineers and geotechnical professionals, landscape architects, planners, environmental educators, First Nations, and municipal staff who can implement change into their communities. And with our third component, demonstrating nature-based solutions, we have demonstration sites in our target communities through creation of these restoration sites that use Green Shores principles. And those restoration projects will be carried out on shorelines of high-value salmon habitat and in locations where it's really high visibility, like public park space. And then our final component is shoreline mapping. So we'll help to contribute to the shoreline mapping work on Vancouver Island with a focus on mapping the extent of hard armoring, as well as other ecological features of the shorelines. So this will involve data capture from boat surveys, as well as community engagement through shoreline mapping workshops. We'll jump in.
All right, and part of our raising awareness components, this year we just launched a new educational primer. It's titled Impacts of Climate Change on Shorelines, People, and Salmon, Nature-Based Approaches for Ecosystem Health. We created a comprehensive version, and it's made available as a resource to local, municipal, and Indigenous governments and stewardship groups, along with a shorter version to serve as an informative booklet that brings home the key messages. And so this booklet will be available for free at our outreach events, which we have listed on our website. And both the documents are available on our website to browse anytime. And the website is resilientcoasts.ca. I'll enter it into the chat box in a bit. And so some of the core topics that we cover in this educational primer are the value of natural shorelines and the coastal food web, natural coastal processes, coastal modification and how it impacts those natural processes, climate change impacts on the east and south coast of Vancouver Island, how sea level rise is changing shorelines, and finally, stewardship of shorelines and how we can use nature-based solutions on the shoreline and in our everyday lives to reduce our environmental impact on the shore, and which we'll go through now. So healthy shorelines nurture life on the coast in many ways. For instance, nearshore and estuarine habitats are critical to many species. You'll find eelgrass meadows, kelp forests, and marshes that support a whole host of species, from birds to forage fish, to salmon, to orcas. These habitats support species with food, shelter, and refuge. For Pacific salmon, the nearshore environment is particularly important as they acclimatize to salt water after leaving freshwater habitats and search for food to grow strong enough for the open ocean journey. Healthy shorelines support forage fish as well, who lay eggs in the beach sediment and are a critical food source for Pacific salmon. Healthy shorelines provide access to food and are linked to coastal cultures, including coastal First Nations. They are a key piece to food security and cultural traditions. Healthy shorelines can help build resilience to climate change for the natural world and coastal communities alike. Estuarine and nearshore habitats help buffer wave energy and impacts from storms, and thus help to reduce flooding and shoreline erosion.
And so we worked with some artists as well as we were developing this primer. So we wanted to feature a couple of the pieces that we had created. And this first one is by Holly Sullivan, and it's depicting the coastal food web, which is really critical to our food sources and our cultures, as Maria mentioned. And so this food web starts with very small organisms. So in the middle, we have kind of a zoomed in area with phytoplankton and zooplankton, who are really at the base of this food web. And these phytoplankton and zooplankton feed the small schooling fish known as forage fish, for example, Pacific herring and Pacific salmons. And forage fish rely on sandy shorelines with riparian vegetation that shade And this is really important spawning ground. So our riparian vegetation is also a critical piece of this food web and conserving our natural shoreline. Forage fish are also a very important food source for many coastal organisms, including Pacific salmon. And our orca whales also love forage fish and salmon, of course. And so we have salmon in there, we have orcas. And then we also included a fishing boat in this illustration because as humans, we play a role in the coastal food web as well. And all of these species and elements are critical to our coastal ways of life, economy, and cultures. And the second piece here was made by Cassandra Bunk, and it illustrates the importance of our shoreline habitat, from the back shore to the subtidal zones and the diversity of life that all of this shoreline supports. And in the primer, we also touch on the importance of shorelines for people, the importance of salmon and the coastal food web to Indigenous cultures, to recreational and commercial fishing and local economies, as well as the benefits that our shorelines provide in terms of recreational space, aesthetic, and spiritual value. And we also provide an overview of coastal processes. So natural coastal processes both maintain and create our beaches, and they're needed to sustain our shorelines and their integrity into the future. Healthy beaches exist in a balance of erosion and deposition, where both processes occur simultaneously. And the movement of the sediment affects the shape and morphology of the beach and the suitability of that habitat for various species. But however, we have developed coastlines and altered the way that they function naturally. So hard armoring, that's the main impact from human development. And it affects our natural shorelines in a lot of different ways. So in many urban locations around the world, more than 50% of shorelines have been hardened by coastal armoring structures. And these are things like seawalls, ripraps, groins, and jetties. And we armor our shorelines with seawalls and riprap, thinking that it's the best line of defense against rising waters, but they may cause more problems than many of us are even aware of. Overtopping, for one, occurs when hard armor is present. As you can see in the illustration on the left, where the incoming wave crashes against the seawall, instead of dissipating as it would on a natural shoreline and slowing down in natural sediment and eelgrass and riparian vegetation. Hard armoring can also cause erosion, which can lead to shifts in critical spawning substrate for forage fish and reduction in riparian vegetation. Hard armoring structures are also at risk of erosion and failure against the rising intensity and frequency of coastal storms. So which you can see on the photo on the right there, which shows an area of the Vancouver seawall after the storms earlier this winter. Seawalls also reduce intertidal habitat and eventually can cause a complete loss of intertidal areas and the associated species, which are so critical and so diverse, as we've seen in the last few illustrations. And this is known as coastal squeeze when we use that critical habitat. When we lose that critical habitat. And finally, these structures reduce the amount of usable beach area and often directly cut off access to the shore. And here we just see some examples of different hard armoring. So on the left, we have a hard armored bluff where the boulders are preventing riparian vegetation from growing on the slope, which would actually benefit the habitat and stabilize the slope. And in the center, we see a beach access path that is no longer usable because the concrete steps have been eroded by incoming waves. And on the right, there's a seawall where the path has been eroded from waves crashing into the wall, overtopping the structure and causing scour of the soft sediment there. And here are some good examples, again, of overtopping and coastal squeeze. So storm surges can cause our beaches to be battered by logs, as you see on the right, which destroy shoreline habitat. And as sea levels rise, these storm surges will get higher and more intense, increasing overtopping and exacerbating coastal squeeze. And as we saw this past winter, many beaches near Victoria were closed due to intense wave action. Did you know that armored shorelines also impact the diets of Pacific salmon? Studies have found that shoreline armoring reduced the number and diversity of epibenthic invertebrates, which are critters that reside on or above the rock, sand, and mud of the seafloor, compared to unarmored shorelines. So as a result, when young salmon are next to a seawall or other artificial structures, they end up feeding on alternative types of prey that might be harder to catch and are actually less nutritious. Quality shallow habitat is also lost under traditional overwater structures like piers and docks. Those structures cast too much shade, so seagrasses and algae can't thrive below. Salmon also avoid those areas because it's too dark, and the lack of light seems to make the salmon nervous. They also can't see their predators, find ample prey, properly orient themselves, or school together. And so they end up altering their natural behaviors and avoid the shallow areas that would usually be their safe havens with plentiful food.
Next, we provide an overview of climate change impacts on Vancouver Island, including a closer look at sea level rise and what it means for our coastal communities. In eastern and southern Vancouver Island specifically, we are already experiencing warmer air and sea surface temperatures and rising sea levels. Extreme events such as the record-shattering heat dome of 2021 will be more common. There will be changes in seasonal precipitation patterns, which can result in increases in periods of drought and more frequent and intense storms. During the winter months, the dominant precipitation type will be rain instead of snow, and this can cause severe flooding like we've been experiencing here in BC. We observed all of these consequences in November 2021, when a series of intense atmospheric river storm events dumped record rainfall across southern British Columbia. This flooding is likely to be the most costly natural disaster in Canadian history due to all the infrastructure and property damage. It is expected that this event will severely affect several populations of salmon. Sea level rise is another major change that's altering our shorelines and threatening coastal communities. Here is a map on the right of Greater Victoria and the Peninsula. You can see the predicted shoreline sensitivity to sea level rise, along with the potential year 2100 coastal floodplain areas. You can find this map and other resources on our website. So this one right here. Projected global sea level rise will be between 30 centimeters to 2.5 meters by 2100, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The impacts of rising sea levels are anticipated to vary markedly among coastlines due to local topography, currents, geological processes such as tectonic activity and post-glacial adjustment, as well as different emission scenarios. In BC, sea level rise is projected to be the greatest on the north coast, the Fraser Lowland, and southern Vancouver Island, ranging from 50 to 70 centimeters by 2100, while the rest of Vancouver Island is projected to experience a much smaller relative rise in sea level. In Victoria, the sea level has risen at a rate of 6.6 centimeters per century, and this rate is accelerating. Even at the modest end of this range, our coastlines as we know them will inevitably change. Together, the different impacts associated with climate change can work cumulatively to result in even greater consequences and challenges for the environment and coastal communities. In addition to increasing sea level, these regions will also experience increasing wind, wave height, and storm intensity. This increase in storm intensity is expected to create even greater storm surges, leading to a heightened potential for shoreline erosion and will cause low-lying regions to flood regularly. Other challenges will include saltwater intrusion, which can greatly impact wells and drinking water, as well as agriculture. What will become increasingly important is in the future is the resilient and adaptive value of healthy, intact shoreline systems in the face of climate change. Natural shorelines are dynamic, and given the space to move, will adjust to rising sea levels and buffer storm energy. This capacity will help protect our coastal communities from storm surges and higher sea levels. Promoting healthy shorelines will also help ensure that we do not lose those habitats that support critical links in the food web, such as forage fish. So change along our coastlines is inevitable because that's what coastal processes do. They make our coastlines dynamic. Any interventions we choose to do are temporary because natural processes will prevail. So it's in our best interest to work with nature and not against it. This is really the crux of what we want to get across with our primer and content. Not to scare anyone with facts about climate change impacts, but to empower communities to make positive changes to adapt to climate change, including using nature-based solutions. So what do we mean by nature-based solutions? It's defined as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. For property owners, there are a lot of steps we can take to protect the natural world. We want to make connections between what we do on the upland and how it impacts the shoreline and aquatic environment. So as you can see in this image on the right, there's a lot of impervious surfaces, like concrete driveways that don't soak up the rain, but let it run off and collect contaminants along the way. And this ends up entering our local beaches. So to manage this runoff, homeowners can do things like harvest rainwater and use it to water their garden. They can replace driveways with pervious pavers or revegetate previously paved areas with native plants to reduce the amount of impervious surfaces. This reduces runoff and allows water to soak into the ground. So it reduces the amount of harmful runoff and at the same time, the groundwater supplies can be recharged. They can also plant a rain garden. Peninsula Streams just hosted a webinar yesterday on rain gardens, and that will be posted on their website shortly, and we're going to be sharing it as well. So you can check that out. This is another great method to accomplish these objectives through the designs that include a swale type structure and water loving plants to hold and collect runoff. And it helps filter pollutants too. And another bonus is that you'll also enjoy the benefits of pollinators visiting your home. And specifically along shorelines, we can take steps like revegetating the riparian area with native plants, providing critical habitat and shade on spawning beaches, and helping to stabilize the shore. And also the removal of invasive plants is also important to avoid competition with the more beneficial native riparian plants. Next slide. We can also look at structures on the shoreline. Where possible, it's best to move infrastructure back from the shore or build new structures set back to plan for sea level rise and allow the shoreline more space to migrate. We can also move away from hard armoring shorelines. Instead of seawalls, we can hire professionals to restore shorelines with nature in mind. This involves coastal geomorphologists, coastal engineers, landscape architects, and biologists. Some of these restorative actions can include: one is regrading the beach to mimic a more natural angle, which helps absorb and slow down wave energy. Just looking back to the example Kyla showed, where the wall, it crashes and overtops. And so instead it will slow down and absorb it. Beach nourishment is another one. In places where shorelines have experienced loss of sediment due to erosional forces worsened by hard armoring, beach nourishment is a process of replenishing the sediment. Professionals can also introduce logs as sills at some sites, which help hold new sediment in place for longer durations. And you can also incorporate sea level rise estimates into these restorative actions. There's also restoration professionals who restore marsh and estuarine habitats. And these ecosystems naturally attenuate wave action and provide vital habitat. So by working with nature for shoreline restoration design, we can adapt to our changing climate and support both humans and the environment. And as another product that we created for our raising awareness component, we created a toolkit that goes hand in hand with the primer. The toolkit is an online library of how-to articles to support citizens making small changes in their homes and habits to reduce their environmental impact. We have articles on topics like reducing microplastic pollution in laundry, how to build a rain garden, and how to decode confusing labels on household cleaning products that claim to be environmentally safe.
And as part of Resilient Coast, we're also developing 3 restoration sites to demonstrate nature-based solutions in action. We currently have 3 demo sites on the east coast of Vancouver Island. 2 are in the Greater Victoria area, and 1 is up in Comox. So here's just an overview of our first demonstration site. This one is in Esquimalt Gorge Park in Esquimalt. And it's a large demonstration site with one part of it being restored as Resilient Coast for Salmon, Green Shores for Shoreline Development Project. And that's the red polygon on the top of the page there. And then another large chunk of the park shown in the green polygon is being restored by World Fisheries Trust. We've had multiple events with the Township of Esquimalt and our demo site partners with the Esquimalt Gorge Park site. So feel free to visit this site to track the progress of the restoration. And our second demo site is a small pocket beach along the Songhees Walkway in Victoria West. This is a small site, but it will be excellent to engage community members since it's right along the Songhees Walkway. And we will also develop signage about the cultural and historical significance of this site and what was done to restore the site. And our third demo site is at Dyke Road Park in the Comox Valley. So restoration of this site will include modification of the shoreline, including adjusting a bird watching platform, which you see in the top right of this photo, and also adding plantings of native species on the shoreline and removing some invasive species. And our final component of Resilient Coast is shoreline mapping. So for the shoreline mapping component, we will collect data on the extent of shoreline modification, like seawalls and other structures, along the shoreline by foot with citizen scientists in workshops, as well as collect data by boat. So starting this summer, we will be hosting mapping workshops with communities from Victoria up to Nanaimo. And in addition to collecting data on the extent of coastal modification, our objective is to provide opportunities to raise awareness and create discussion on topics like sea level rise, natural coastal processes, coastal squeeze, impacts to forage fish and the greater food web, and what we can do about it, most importantly. So we're currently working on selecting beaches of interest based on variables like shoreline type, vulnerability to sea level rise and coastal flooding, and predicted suitable forage fish spawning sites. And for our boat-based mapping, we have our small vessel, Wilbur, which is shown in the photo here. And Wilbur has been fitted with a 360-degree camera mounted on the top. And this will be capturing video data on the shorelines at high tide, as well as capturing high-resolution photos every 4 seconds. And by the end of the summer, we will have collected video and photo data by boat from Victoria up to Nanaimo. And throughout the 5 years, we'll continue to collect that data. And all of this data will be housed at the Strait of Georgia Data Center, which will be, and then overlaid on maps where you can click on all images and video along any section of the shoreline. And then we will digitize the seawalls and other structures into GIS as line data, so anyone can explore the extent of coastal modification at the local level. And there's currently a gap in the knowledge of the extent of hard armoring on our coast. So this work is helping to build a valuable data set, which will be publicly available for researchers, municipal planners, homeowners, and other government staff. And using these data, we can advocate for removal of armoring structures, encourage policy change for shoreline development, and protection of valuable habitat. So thank you for joining us, and be sure to check out our website to learn more, to check out our primer and toolkit, and please reach out to me and I'll put my email and those links in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Kyla and Maria. Wonderful presentation. That is excellent. I'll just share my screen here for the next one. And just a reminder to folks to please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll kind of track them and think on them and have a Q&A session at the end. Excellent. So for the next presentation, we're going to take everything that we've just learned from Kyla and Maria and apply it to kind of this focal area of Seaham Harbor and Roberts Bay, which make up Shoal Harbor and the Shoal Harbor Migratory Bird Sanctuary. Quite a significant area. And we'll, for a number of different reasons, and some of those reasons we'll discuss here. I'd just like to begin by introducing our beach program. Peninsula Stream Society has been running its beach program since 2018. It's pillared by research and advocacy, stewardship and restoration, and education and outreach. And these are all kind of things that we work with local communities on and incorporate into. A large part of this beach program is our forage fish monitoring. It's part of a larger network. We kind of have the southern tip of Vancouver Island, but we work with a number of different stewardship groups all across the Sailor Sea and beyond in monitoring for forage fish beach spawn locations. And what that looks like is, we have a standardized methodology in which community scientists can go out and sample their local beach sediments, screen them using a certain methodology, and basically look under a microscope and identify whether or not these beaches are being used by our local forage fish species for spawning. So just like spawning salmon use gravels and rivers to lay their eggs and allow them to incubate and develop, so do our local forage fish species, but actually on our local shorelines. So these sediments and beaches that we're talking about are incredibly important for them. We have, in addition to Pacific herring, we also have two species that are a little lesser known. One is the surf smelt on the top photo on the left there, and on the bottom, just below it, the Pacific sand lance. The surf smelt above uses kind of the higher area of the beach, and the sand lance uses the middle to lower. Their eggs, pictured in the top right there, are very difficult to see, very tiny, and they adhere to and bury into the sediment, so the smaller sands and coarser sands materials. So those are very important for the species. And forage fish, are kind of a trophic level in that that's not any kind of criteria other than that they're acting to transition energy throughout the food chain. So they're extremely important to those characteristic species that we all love and want to protect, like the salmon, as well as the killer whales, and are integral parts of our marine food webs in the Sailor Sea. We have put a huge effort into sampling our local beaches and identifying where these forage fish are spawning in our area. And since 2018, we've sampled over 90 beaches, different beaches, 150 different sites, with over 700 different samples. We've also trained a number of close to hundreds of volunteers in this methodology, which is also essentially training them to see it like a forage fish and view their beaches as a forage fish in a habitat sense. Which is incredibly powerful to have this quote unquote army of community scientists out there on the shorelines, being our eyes and ears and detecting changes and impacts to our local shoreline. So it's been an incredibly successful program, and thank you to our volunteers and community scientists who participate. This is a map of the area in which we've sampled. As you can see, we have a huge dispersion. The blue circles represent kind of the effort, so the number of samples we've had in certain locations. And so we've tried to have a really spread out, distributed effort for where we sample. When we look at where we found certain eggs, so the green circles are that surf smelt, and the blue and the pink circles are that Pacific sand lance. What we see is really in the north end of the peninsula, we've had a bit of a pattern emerge where we're getting a lot of detections of our forage fish up in that area, and in particular surf smelt. And what's interesting, that first map where I showed all of our different partners who are doing the sampling, surf smelt's not really being detected by any of them other than us. So what we have is a really kind of a significant amount of surf smelt being detected. And when we close in on North Saanich, we also realize that there's this pattern where we're getting huge detections in and around Seam Harbor and Roberts Bay or Shoal Harbor. And I can't emphasize enough how significant this is. What we have is a core habitat of an incredibly important species where they're coming to spawn. And we have all sorts of anecdotes about these fish coming into the harbor and utilizing these shorelines to lay their eggs and continue their species. So this is a really special place in the eyes of surf smelt, as well as Pacific sand lance, and a really incredibly important area, not only for the South Island, but regionally in the Sailor Sea. Kind of looking at the satellite photo, we can see that this area has undergone significant modification, and there are lots of impacts and changes that have occurred to this site. And it's quite incredible that we're still getting those numbers of fish coming through, quite frankly. We have dredging that's occurred, lots of ship traffic, development, hard armoring of shorelines, pollution, water quality, all of these things are kind of working to create this cumulative impact in this area. And so we've really honed in and started to look at some of these impacts and begun considering what it is we can do to try to mitigate or alleviate some of them. Closing in on Roberts Bay, similar impacts, lots of development, seawall hard armoring, development, densities increasing. We've seen a lot of changes happening here. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Nikki from Sea Change, who's been involved with the World Wildlife Fund study of the carbon resources, the eelgrasses, and the marsh, and just hand it over to her.
Good evening. On this slide, you will see quite a few green dots with a few yellow. And in the early spring of this year, Sea Change survey crew went out on a boat with an underwater camera to assess how healthy and how in the area extent to the eelgrass, the native eelgrass off the shores of Roberts Bay. And what they found was, for the most part, a very continuous bed. All those green dots are showing continuous, which means it was rather dense with very few spaces in between. The yellow dots are where it's becoming patchy or has been patchy. And there seems to be kind of a hole in the center there. And that could very well just be the reason for lack of eelgrass being a very deep area in that hole. So surprisingly, I was all armed with a budget and crew ready to go to do restoration at this site. And according to the survey crew and observations that they had made, the necessity for restoration at this time is not necessary. But if you look at the north end there, you'll see that there's quite a few yellow dots, meaning that it's quite patchy. And the next slide will show you an approximate presence of intertidal eelgrass in 2004, taken by ShoreZone. And that pink line will show that most likely there was more eelgrass on the north end. The supposition is, but we're not entirely assured, that the southeasterlies from the winter storms might be affecting that area. I don't know. And according to the residents of the beach, around the beach there, word has it that the eelgrass has been moving seaward over time, that it was quite possible for families to play in eelgrass at low tides 30 years ago. And now you have to wait for a very extreme low tide. The reasons for that are multiple, but it could very well be because the wave action arriving on the shore and the resistance that those waves are meeting is increasing the sedimentation to go further seaward and affecting the eelgrass to move further out. It's all supposition, but it's quite possible. The other features that we wanted to really look at, because they're being so heavily affected by climate change, is the wetlands at Roberts Bay. And that is, I'm going to take it over to Sarah Cook to fill you in on this, but it's a fascinating and very kind of sad story.
Thanks very much, Nikki, and good evening to everyone as well. So when we got involved in this project, we wanted to go back and see if there was a way to quantify the historical extent of the salt marsh at Mermaid Creek, which is in the southern portion of Roberts Bay. And we went back and sourced some orthophoto imagery and some satellite imagery, and were able to import that into a program that allowed us to draw these ideas of the extent of the salt marsh over time. And what we found, what you can see here is this light blue polygon is showing you the extent of that salt marsh in 1964 versus what we saw in 2021, which is when we did this project. And you can see that the salt marsh has not only shrunk, it's lost about 2,500 meters squared from our estimates, but it's also migrated landward. So the upper edge of that salt marsh was actually lower down the beach, and it's starting to migrate landward, possibly due to the some increased wave action. We're not really sure exactly what was driving that, but the front edge was eroding, so it started to move backward. It now has, of course, run up against the terrestrial vegetation and the development in the background, so there's not really anywhere left for it to go. So it's experiencing that coastal squeeze that Kyla and Maria were talking about earlier. And then we actually were able to go back out. So Kyle and the group from Peninsula Streams and Shorelines were able to go back out and take some drone imagery. I think, was it April, Kyle? Yeah, it was in April. And so we actually went and updated this map. So if you could flip that over, Kyle. And we're actually able to see that it has shrunk even more. So the dark purple here is showing what is remaining of the marsh. This is actually due to a great deal of sediment that's been dumped on top of the marsh. So you can actually see a good bit of that pink in one area where it's sort of become very, very patchy and very discontinuous. There was a good bit of sediment that was actually dumped up on the marsh by the wave action for the winter storms. We're hoping that if restoration is able to go ahead in this area, we'll be able to reclaim some of that, and maybe perhaps even remove some of that sediment from the marsh to allow it to recover. But this is a really sort of dynamic system, and it's been really interesting to track it over such a smaller scale, but it's definitely showing the impacts that have been contributing to the size of the marsh in recent years. And I think it's back to you, Kyle.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, and a key takeaway is, it's becoming apparent that this marsh is disappearing, and that we need to take action in order to stop the erosion and potentially reverse it. So that being said, under all of these kind of modifications, changes, the importance of this habitat to birds and wildlife, forage fish, and marine ecosystem and food chains, we've really been considering what can be done. And we've taken a number of different strategies to protecting and restoring the shoreline. And this could include things like salt marsh and sediment replenishment, as well as eelgrass plantings and beach nourishment for certain areas. This would improve the resiliency to sea level rise and coastal squeeze, as we've learned, as well as increase our understanding on some of these dynamics, whether they be sediment or the blue carbon storage or some of the ecosystem dynamics. So we really, over the next couple of years, want to improve our knowledge about these systems, but also begin to take action to protect them, and whether that's conservation or restoration. And part of that is taking baselines. So as Sarah mentioned, we did get out to Roberts Bay and do some drone surveys. We've also taken large steps to partner with the Sakem First Nation and undertake a study to kind of discover these baselines using different knowledge systems. So we'll be looking at it through a Western lens, where we'll have a lot of engineers looking at coastal and sediment dynamics and modeling and hydrographics, bathymetries, and really dive in to understand these systems, and in particular their physical and biological characteristics, but as well look and listen to some of the historical accounts, whether it be oral or anecdotal, and try to re-envision what these systems once looked like, in order to understand what we can try to restore them to, and use this to create a roadmap, identify certain areas where we can do restoration, and create priorities, and look at this really strategically. The marsh picture behind Katrina is an area that we'd like to begin right away, as it is a pressing concern. One of the tools we have is nourishment. These are some photos taken kind of outlining that approach I'm describing, that we kind of get an understanding of the baseline through historical accounts of what an ecosystem looked like, get an idea of how it's functioning right now. So the 2009 photo in Pat Bay, and then do some treatment. So in 2018, Peninsula Stream Society, in partnership with the Saken First Nation and the Ministry of Transportation, were able to do a large-scale nourishment project across many phases over many years at Patricia Bay Beach. And this has been successful largely. And we've seen forage fish spawning in these materials. They're much more friendly for people. So that is an option that we would like to explore in both Roberts Bay as well as in CM Harbor, across kind of private and public lands. This photo didn't expand well, but this is a basic concept for what we are working towards for protection of the marsh. Our geologist, our engineering geologist, is still creating designs for us within this complex system, and we hope to pilot some sort of treatment this summer, late summer, early fall. And what this would look like is kind of creating a berm or a protective structure to kind of absorb some of that wave action and allow it to disperse, as well as bringing in some material and raising the elevation of the marsh and planting into it and getting some vegetation established. So that's basically what we are working towards, and we are working to develop a plan, which we will then communicate with the community and pursue. But the risk of doing nothing is getting to be too great. That being said, with the CM Harbor and Roberts Bay studies, we are looking for allies, essentially waterfront owner allies who potentially are interested in some of these approaches. Maybe your seawall is starting to degrade. Maybe you're worried about some of these erosion, protecting your shoreline, and want to take a nature-based approach. We really would like to align with you. And in particular, if you can get a couple of your neighbors on board, the economy of scale of these projects, it works really well if we can get a number of parcels and connectivity together and include that into our priority setting. There is potential to find funding if we could connect up a few different parcels of property, of shoreline property, and do a project. Because we are looking at regionally, we're looking for this type of solution. And so if you can get in on it early, I think we can work together and we can try to find solutions at a larger scale within these areas. I won't say any more than that. So anyway, we'll open it up to questions and answers now. That's all we have for you right now, but we certainly can answer some questions and have a discussion around some of this. And if you're not comfortable doing the Q&A, our numbers and emails are up there. We'd be happy to connect with you further on this and discuss some of these things. Thank you very much. So looking at these questions, the first question we have is from Lindsay. And I should just add that we also have joining us on our panel in the late hour, Jacqueline Bars from the World Wildlife Foundation, and she will also be here to answer questions as well. And she's super knowledgeable in this stuff and a huge supporter of these projects. Can boulders be mixed with softer restorative measures as an emergency measure to mitigate spots of extreme erosion in front of a beachfront house? So I'll leave it open for anyone to jump in on that, as I think a few of us are qualified, more or less, to at least provide some insight. And maybe I'll just stop my share. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can start out. I definitely say that is an option. It's very site specific. And so we would call that a hybrid approach where you're using a little bit of armoring, but also some nature-based solutions. And in some cases, that is the best that is suitable for the site. And so I would definitely recommend that it would be good to have the site assessed by a coastal professional to look at the wave action on that site, to look at projected sea level rise and flooding, to consider what are the potential impacts and what are the factors impacting that site. And yeah, like I said, sometimes the home is already too close to the water line, and unless moving that structure back from the shoreline is an option for you, often some armoring is recommended, but there are definitely ways that you can still add habitat value if that is something that you need to do on the property. One example is adding some riparian vegetation behind that structure or by the bouldering to provide some overhanging riparian vegetation that shades the forage fish spawning sediment if you have that on your shoreline. So adding native trees and shrubs to your shoreline. So it's definitely an option to have a hybrid approach.
Thanks, Kyle. Ian?
Yeah, I'd just like to add to what was just said by Kyla, is that Kyle and I are working with a property owner on in the Ardmore area on a hybrid approach, where we're looking at some hard armoring because of the type of erosion, but with beach nourishment and planting. So hybrid approaches are, again, it's an option, and it's a site-by-site form fit type of application.
And for that, the hard armoring's going in, the boulders are going in areas where if we did nothing, some very large mature trees would be recruited by the beach and potentially pose kind of a hazard to the public that use that particular stretch of shoreline. So, by going in and addressing kind of these focal areas along a very large shoreline with hard armoring while leaving the rest open for those natural processes, that was kind of the calculus that went into that, as far as benefits to costs. And so, we're protecting some large mature trees, we're using hard armoring and interrupting those processes there. But at the same time, we're protecting those trees, and we're working with the homeowner to leave the other areas unprotected to allow continually that recruitment of sediment onto the shore. And he's allowing us to do some nourishment, which is fantastic. Does anyone else have anything to add? Okay, Malcolm Falconer asks, if eelgrass is transplanted and restored, do you have the ability to temporarily restrict anchorage? Ooh, that's a good question. And I bet Nikki's just dying, or Sarah is dying to answer that one.
It's a great question. I really appreciate it. We have two places that we have a voluntary eelgrass protection zone installed. One is at Manion Bay off of Bowen Island that Maria was helpful in helping us out there, and also Gibson's Harbor, also in Howe Sound. Another one is about to be installed in the Cowichan Estuary. All three of those areas have had eelgrass transplants. We're trying to mimic what's going on in Puget Sound. So the logo on these buoys are the same. There'll be logo recognition with cross-boundary boaters. And to be really frank with you, it's not cheap. It's $15,000 for installation of 5 buoys. But what the hope is that boaters will educate each other, just as we're hoping shoreline residents will educate each other, and our jobs will be obsolete because the general population, especially those people most using the near shore, will educate each other just like we educate each other about jaywalking. We don't do that here in Victoria. So yes, there are ways. It does cost a little bit, but it seems to be very effective in places like Port Townsend, and we're hoping the same across the border here. Thanks for that question.
Thank you, Nikki. And we'll go to Jacqueline with her hand up there, followed by Ian, if that's not still a relic hand from Ian.
So one of the things as well is some of the districts can actually start implementing certain bylaws that are helping them out to think about how anchoring occurs in some areas. And the District of North Vancouver is actually implementing a new bylaw within Deep Cove and such around how you anchor in certain sites. So these types of things, voluntary and bylaws, can be implemented in these areas to better protect eelgrass habitat.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Ian?
Yeah, I just want to say, if Bob Thompson, if you're still there, hi Bob, how you doing? And Peninsula Streams will be attending several events, including some of the Music in the Park events in Central Saanich, as well as the fall fair at the Saanich Fairgrounds. So yeah, we'll be out there spreading the word.
Okay. Next question is, what is the impact of freshwater levels Mermaid Creek on the Salt Marsh area. That's something that I think we'll be working towards looking further into and doing further assessments on. It certainly plays some role, not necessarily the only role, but it's certainly having an impact. Looking at the changes in the watershed, we've seen a lot more development, a lot more water being rooted into a system that's already been really heavily modified. So Mermaid Creek, also known as Roberts Slough, is kind of the saline slough that once stretched, much further up landward, and would have been, tidally influenced. And it's suffered, decades of modification. There's records from, I think, the 20s or 30s of it being dug out for people to be able to get their boats up into. And that alone would have played kind of a destructive role and an erosive role in those channels, and caused some slumping. But certainly, one of the things that we hope to do is take a look at a lot of these freshwater inputs into these systems, looking at the quality and the quantity, and taking a targeted approach, whether it's build rain gardens or working with municipalities to do pilot projects for stormwater retention or treatment, and also continue to educate people about some of these urban waterways, and hold our governments accountable. So one of our asks from council was for formal rainwater management planning for that system. So continuing to put that pressure on, working with different community groups and residents, and of course assisting with that and what that might look like. There's lots of different examples that other municipalities have done really quite successfully. Victoria has a stormwater utility charge, different regulations around developments and redevelopments. These are all can be incorporated into local bylaws and OCPs, and can really help with that issue. So short answer, we don't know, but it's something, and we hope to learn more and address it as best as we can. Does anyone have? Oh, Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of add to that a bit, Kyle, and sort of it is difficult to know what the actual water levels coming out of the creek, the impact that they have on the salt marsh, but certainly, we know that the quality of the water coming out of that creek can certainly have a big impact on the salt marsh, and certainly, the rest of the bay itself. So it's a really important point to consider, because salt marshes exist at that interface between the land and the sea, and while they are intertidal habitats, there is a huge influence of the freshwater systems on those habitats as well. So it's something we've really got to make sure to take into consideration, and we'll hopefully be able to study further.
Sarah. What does shoreline nourishment consist of, and how viable is it as a long-term solution if hard armoring of shoreline persists? That's a great question. Do any of our panelists want to jump on that? Ian?
Kyle, I know you want to take it.
Okay, well, I'll take a stab. Shoreline nourishment. So what we mean by that is looking at some of the materials that have been eroded away due to that hard armoring, or of either the source or what's there. Whatever's caused that material to disappear, and looking at nourishing it, replacing it. And typically what we do is we would look at reference conditions or reference sites. So what, if there's a site on the same shoreline or nearby shoreline with a certain material that is subject to the same kind of energy and erosive forces, we kind of take a look at that. And get an analysis of the range of sediment sizes within that, and then create an artificial one using rock and sediment from our local aggregate yards, and delivering that to the beach. and spreading it out. The Pat Bay project, let's scroll up, there's some really good pictures of that. Was a really successful example of that, where Ian and company brought in a lot of material onto that beach to try to replicate what used to be there. The second part of your question, how, if the same forces are still there and the same conditions are still there, won't that sediment just disappear? And I think yes, over a period of time, it will require re-nourishment is the short answer of that. And so as far as, a permanent solution, these are dynamic systems. A lot of time in restoration, what the course is to provide kind of that surrogate while you work to solve other issues. So in the case of stream restoration, a lot of the time you're bringing in large wood debris. Will that last forever? No, but hopefully it'll be there long enough for trees to kind of recruit on their own and grow and become those large materials that can then fall in. So from a restoration standpoint, where you're trying to return the system, it's kind of a bridge until you can sort something else out. In some of these systems where you'll never really be able to fully recover the system, then it could be an ongoing, you'll never fully restore the system, but you can continue to enhance it. And we're working with the municipality to identify areas and access to remain open so that we can continue to provide that nourishment to some of these areas, because we know it works, and we know that it is a significant feature of the habitat to have that sediment there. I think that's the best I can answer that question. Ian, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say there's a couple things. In the terms of Pat Bay, you're quite right. We took a reference beach and used that as the material guide, as well as we realized that in Pat Bay, the shoreline longshore transports from north to south. So there is already an indication that the northern end is becoming rockier and the material is migrating to the south as we predicted. We're fortunate that there's an access point that we can bring in more material on the north. So it's basically reloading the material on the northern end, and we could even be at some point in time in the future harvesting down at the southern end, almost at Tentang Creek, and moving that sediment potentially back up to the north end, and just reloading the drift cell back to from north to south as it goes. So it is possible to provide that beach nourishment, and beach nourishment will also mitigate mitigate the impact of storm surge and wave action by making the waves having to climb vertically up, which takes energy out of the waves, which is a very important part of beach nourishment, in the sense that it doesn't just replace the habitat values and provide benefits for humans to enjoy the beach, but in fact mitigates the force of the waves by making them climb against gravity. So yeah, so it can be a process. What we're looking for is to provide function. And as Kyle said, sometimes within ecological restoration, the function is temporary, and you may have to keep working on that over time to keep that function going.
Thanks, Ian. Our next question from Kim is, has the town of Sidney incorporated the PSS Mermaid Creek salt marsh restoration to their new official community plan goals? I'll speak to what I know, which isn't much. That they have made an official kind of order to go and investigate stormwater management within the Mermaid Creek catchment and look at alternatives and updating. Ian, do you want to jump in here? See your hand up there.
Yeah, and I also see Jacqueline. I did have an opportunity to tour the Mermaid Creek estuary and salt marsh area with Corey Newcomb from the town of Sidney, who's their chief planner that's dealing with their OCP, and impressed upon him what we were doing and what we were trying to achieve. And I'm fully believe that he gets it, and that some of the language that will be in the OCP will facilitate opportunities for us to do the restoration. So as opposed to sort of specifying or putting a prescription in, it's more that the OCP will encourage and provide pathways for groups like ourselves and others to achieve those goals.
Jacqueline, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, because this whole piece, especially around the official community plans, is there's also an overarching bioregional framework that's being looked at to really try better aligning North Saanich, Sidney, and Central Saanich within their language, working and looking at how to maintain more consistent bylaws, especially since a lot of these areas overlap. And you really look at it with the reflection that Nikki and Sarah and Kyle and Ian were talking about with around Seam Harbor, because of course that's shared jurisdictionally between North Saanich and Sidney. So a lot of these languages are put in, but some of the things that have kind of stepped up council-wise as well is that when Kyle presented, besides looking at that rainwater plan and management around that stormwater, they were also thinking about how do we better protect what's kind of going on around Mermaid Creek. And so they started putting in information about trying to reduce, people walking on that area and causing bank slumpage and things. So there is an energy that seems to be happening that they are looking to better protect these types of systems or find ways of working collaboratively with other jurisdictions to better protect both Roberts Bay and Seam Harbor and Seam Harbor.
Great, thanks. That's a great answer. Next question from Bob, essentially wondering if we're working with the Canadian Wildlife Service, keeping them informed in reference to the migratory bird sanctuary and in terms of funding. Ian, do you want to speak to that one?
Well, CWS actually has come into the picture just recently, and we've actually are involved in a project now that has some CWS people, or people at least with CWS email addresses. So I believe that part of Environment Canada is paying attention. I don't know if there's any, the funding is specifically bird related, although I think that Environment Canada recognizes the migratory bird sanctuary as being important. So there is a connection there, but not direct funding.
Certainly for restoration efforts and any investment from Environment and Climate Change Canada, they want to make sure that their investment is secure and that there's some level of protection. And so having that migratory bird sanctuary layer of protection looks really good on the application. And they're also interested in biodiversity. So it certainly plays a large role. And as Ian said, it is an area of focus for sure. Outreach to Islands Trust and Gulf Islanders from Mick Collins.
Can I wonder if the clarification from Mick's question, is this with regards to kind of the resilient coasts for salmon work and other pieces? I definitely know that Islands Trust has municipality members have been involved with the forage fish kind of engagement session, and thus have been introduced to the Resilient Coast for Salmon's work through presentations there. And I think Mick is looking to ask his question live.
Yeah, thanks, Jacqueline. I mean, you've got a big geographic area and a lot of good resource materials, and you can't do all the Gulf Islands in this kind of round one of this work, but there's certainly a lot of interest over on the islands in what you're doing, and our local stewardship, as you know, is through the Islands Trust. So maybe it can get on one of their council agendas at some point when all the trustees from all the islands meet, or they have ways to share it, so it gets to the politicians and not just the staff. Thank you.
Kyla, I think that's to you, and I think that's something that you, myself, Isabel, and such can talk about for getting more of those presentations out.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a great idea. Thanks, Mick, for bringing that to our attention. And yeah, there's definitely a lot we want to accomplish in the 5 years. And in year 5, the geographic region we're concentrated on is kind of rural areas and the islands if we have time, if we have the capacity. So it's definitely on our radar. We want to reach those communities for sure. So we have been looking into events, and yeah, really good idea to reach out to the Islands Trust. Thank you.
Good. Thanks.
Okay, and we're about, where are we at here? 8:12. So we're a little bit over time, but and thank you, Jocelyn, for pointing us to the specific policy that says that the OCP of Sidney supports the restoration and maintenance of the Mermaid Creek estuary. And thanks for your diligence and keeping us informed on the OCP process in Sydney and all of the hard work you do. Susan, what can we do as the public to help protect eggs laid on Rocky Beach and Roberts Bay?
I can take a stab at that.
Sure, thanks, Jacqueline.
So some of the things is kind of get an understanding as to when spawning efforts occur. A lot of this information is up on the Strait of Georgia Data Center, as well as Ian and Kyle would be willing to share it and stuff like that. Roberts Bay tends to have a very significant kind of spawning period, predominantly really heavy around the February, March period. However, detections of surf smelt have occurred a little bit earlier as well into February and January. But that being said, when you kind of have these concentrated periods and you kind of know when these types of times are, you think about, you know, not really walking a lot on the beach or having a lot of dogs and such. Particularly dogs would be the big thing for kicking up and stirring up a lot of the beach pieces. Otherwise, though, you know, these eggs are pretty resilient. They can deal with people treading on them. The sediment and the wave activity is already shifting them down a little bit deeper, and there's a reason why that the scooping tends to be a little bit deeper. But a lot of it as well is just making people aware and making the community aware. And so a lot more of this information is going out there and being shared. And the Marine Reference Guide that the Strait of Georgia has done is a really good reference, and it's been being shared out now with municipalities as a tool. And there are upcoming workshops being done for municipal governments to kind of give them an idea of how to use open access data as a way to help direct policies and pieces. And it looks like Ian's going to speak in some more.
Well, yeah, well, thanks, Jacqueline. I was just going to say that it's interesting at Roberts Bay because at the Ardwell entrance, which is a very popular one in the wintertime because of daytime high tides being so prevalent, that's often the piece of beach that's available. It always has spawn on it pretty well every day of the winter. So from November through till March, you're pretty well certain to find surf smelt eggs on that little tiny chunk of beach that's at the top of the beach at the Ardwell access, which kind of really got me going on looking at the rest of Roberts Bay, in the sense that if they're spawning that heavily on that small patch of beach, if there was more beach for them to spawn on, would there be more successful at what they're doing. So, and again, they are pretty hardy. We found eggs on that patch of beach when there's been an enormous amount of foot traffic, and the eggs are still alive. Having said that, we also find dead eggs, and many dead eggs in the wintertime. We don't know what caused their death. So again, whether foot traffic, dogs, displacement are having a significant impact on survivability of those eggs is not known. But I wouldn't want to kick people off the beach either. So yeah, it's a tough one to know.
Thank you. I'm looking at this page and just realizing that a very important funder is missing, the World Wildlife Fund. Thank you, and Jacqueline's on this call for all of your support, financial and also just answering all the tough questions. Yeah, and with that, I mean, if there aren't any other questions, I mean, I think we're all happy to stay on and continue, but it looks like we're wrapping up here. So thanks to everyone who tuned in. Like I said, please reach out if you have more questions and concerns. If you're interested in shoreline restoration within North Saanich and beyond, we'd love to help you out and direct you at least in the right direction, if not support you. And thank you all to all the panelists this evening for giving up your evenings. I very much appreciate it. Thank you very much, Kyla, Jacqueline, Maria, the Sea Change ladies, Nikki and Sarah, and Ian. I really appreciate everyone coming on here. And once again, thanks to everyone for tuning in and caring about this important issue. And with that, I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, Cal, for organizing this.
Thank you.